Hello everyone, my name is Arjan, welcome to Atelier AG, and for this video I actually made 2 sculpts instead of 1. The inspiration for this project came to me when I was browsing the D&D monster manual and passed by the Death Knight entry. I began reading the description and I thought it was amazing. I really hate the trope of the perfectly good paladin, so the concept of a paladin that has fallen from grace and has been turned into a corrupted undead creature really spoke to me. But then I saw the artwork that goes with this description. I mean, all I could think of when I saw the artwork was this. I don't mean to bash on the original artist, I'm just saying I personally don't feel like it conveys the horrors of the Death Knight's origin story. I decided I wanted to try sculpting a Death Knight myself and see if I could make it a little bit more unnerving. The monster manual also speaks a little bit about the story of Lord Soth, a paladin turned Death Knight made famous in the Dragonlance novels. Reading more and more about Lord Soth, I realized it would be cool to try and focus more on the tragic story of becoming a Death Knight, and I figured I could do that by making 2 sculpts, one of the paladin and one of the Death Knight, kind of like a before and after the fall from grace. I decided to start working on the paladin for reasons that will become clear later on in the video. I made a little sketch for scale and used metal wire and tin foil for the armature as I usually do. I used Sculpey because it gives me plenty of time to work on getting the anatomy and other details just right. I think the video speaks for itself, but I do want to focus on a couple of details that I think worked quite well. The first thing I wanted to focus on is chainmail. Chainmail is a notoriously difficult thing to sculpt, and depending on the scale there are several methods to sculpt it. Since the scale I'm working on right now is rather large, I really wanted to sculpt the chainmail as detailed as I could, with the individual rings visible. Unfortunately, this proved to be way too difficult. Even on an almost flat surface I could not get it to work, let alone on the folded parts of the chainmail. So I chose to use a less detailed method. I sculpted the chainmail hood as if it was a thick fabric, and I used a small ballpoint tool to create texture that looks like chainmail. I think the result is relatively good, but I'm curious to hear if you know other ways of sculpting chainmail. Let me know in the comments if you do. The second thing I would like to focus on is the armor. I find it very difficult to sculpt smooth surfaces. I just can't get it perfect, and for the paladin's armor I felt like it had to be as smooth as possible. So I sculpted it as smoothly as I could and baked it in the oven. After that I used files and sandpaper to remove all the tool marks that were still visible. I feel like this worked out wonderful, and I will surely use this technique more in the future. The last thing I want to focus on is the helmet, and it also explains why I decided to start sculpting the Paladin and not the Death Knight. Instead of sculpting everything twice, I wanted to make molds so that I could create a copy of the sculpt that I could modify into the Death Knight. I knew that making a mold of the Paladin wouldn't be too much of a hassle, but I wanted the helmet to be removable, and I did not want to sculpt it twice. To sculpt the helmet, I used a similar technique that I used for my Nautilus dice. Check out the video if you haven't seen it yet. With plastiline clay, I sculpted the shape of the helmet over the head of the Paladin. Then, with green stuff, I sculpted the actual helmet. When the green stuff was cured, I carefully removed the helmet from the sculpt and removed all of the yellow clay from inside of the helmet. I made a 2-part mold of the helmet. I will make a video on mold making sometime. It is an amazing craft and I think it deserves its own video. In the meantime, check out Robert Alone. His channel is dedicated to mold making and casting, and I've learned so much from watching his videos. Anyway, here you see the 2 mold parts. My idea was that I would pour the resin into one mold and then push the other into it and leave it to cure. The wall thickness of the helmet is really thin, so there was a big chance there would be a ton of bubbles in the cast. I was very surprised that the result wasn't actually that bad. There were a few bubbles here and there that I could easily fill with some green stuff, and I also used a rotary tool to open the slits in the helmet's visor. I also made a mold for the body using this janky setup. The mold could have been a lot smaller, but I still had some silicone that was already getting old, so I wanted to use it before it got bad. When the mold had cured, I poured some resin and ended up with a copy of the Paladin. It turned out the silicone I used was actually too old, so there were tons of bubbles all over the cast. For this specific cast it really didn't matter that much because I plan to go crazy on this cast with my rotary tool. I do want to stress that whenever you are sanding, cutting or otherwise working resin, wear a mask. Fine resin dust is toxic and especially with power tools it gets everywhere. Safety first. I started with the face, grinding down the nose, eyes and mouth. I made sure to leave the eyebrows, the bridge of the nose and the chin intact because these define the shape of the skull. I completely removed the mouth so that I could sculpt the teeth with green stuff. After that, I continued with the rotary tool to create all sorts of scratches and weathering on the armor. This was so much fun and I feel like it turned out quite nice. All the bubbles on the casting actually created a great texture on the armor, like it was all dented and beaten up. I then cleaned all of the pieces to remove any mold release, clay or grease to make sure paint would stick to everything. I started painting the Paladin first and I really wanted to push myself on this paint job. There are basically two parts of the paint job, the face and the armor. The face was relatively easy, but the armor was a huge struggle. Because it's such a big part of the sculpt, I wanted to paint the armor in a non-metallic metal. I've tried this on smaller projects, but this was quite a challenge. I used a Miniac video as a guide and it helped out a ton. I've linked this video in the description, it is very informative, so go check it out. Anyway, I feel like I've learned a lot, but I'm not 100% satisfied with the result. Let me know in the comments what you think, and more importantly, what I could have done different to make it look better. The Death Knight was a lot more fun to paint, because I could really go wild with different colors, washes and weathering. I stippled some highlights and shadows all over the armor to create a very matte looking surface. I then added some regular washes to create some dark shadows and to accentuate all of the textures I created with the rotary tool. To create some more specular highlights, I did some edge highlighting and some painted on scratches. I also dry brushed the entire armor to bring out the finer details a little more. After that, I tinted everything with multiple oil washes. I used several browns to really sell the rusted and weathered look. The final step were the plinths. I wanted to enforce the theme even more, so I used a wire brush to texture the Death Knight's plinth and stained the wood with a very dark brown. I sanded the plinth for the Paladin smooth and stained it with a very warm light brown. This warm orangey brown contrasts really nice with the colder blue of the armor, so I think this turned out very nice. And here is the final result. I really enjoyed working on these two sculpts. I wanted these to show that there's nobody who is 100% good or 100% evil, and that they're always somewhere in between. I feel like this is true in real life, and I try to incorporate this into the games I run and play in. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you can leave a like. You can subscribe if you want to see more of these kind of things. You can share it with your friends. That really helps out a lot. You can also follow me on Instagram to get work in progress updates. I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye.